I found it. All right, guys, so we're ready to start. So you really have a great person with Diane. She's been talking to me ever since we made contact. We've had a little review session. She's made sure that your invite was correct. So you guys should have accolades to her for all the good work she's done for you. So my name is Vera Krishik. I've been at the University of Minnesota for 30 years. I've been a USDA employee for 35 years. I started out in Maryland. Then I went and worked for the USDA, the feds. I was one of the people that was on the first organic committee. Hate to tell you how old I am. I'm 72. So the organic committee, that was 1988.
They will probably arrange short.
Okay.
And then I went off to the New York Botanical Garden, and then I came here. So I'm going to talk to you about how you make IPM programs for bugs in your backyard. So you have to get a common knowledge. It's like learning French. We have to all understand the same thing. So let's start out with this picture here. I heard somebody say that, oh, there's a Japanese beetle. Yep, that's a Japanese beetle. And you can tell it by these filiform antennae. You see these antennae that are sticking out that are broad. Look at the antennae on these other beetles. They're called filiform. So sorry, this is a lamellate, this is a filiform. These are even, this one has this little fan on the edge. And one of the things to help you understand how to identify bugs in your backyard is insect evolution is very conservative. And so if you know how to tell insects apart, which I just showed you, then it's going to help you identify how to manage them, because these 4 insects here, you would manage in a similar way. They're leaf-feeding beetles. This is in a different family. It's in the family Scarabaeidae. And so you manage them completely different. So it helps you if you know you have leaf-feeding beetles, elm leaf beetles in this group, viburnum leaf beater, all those beetles, then it's much easier to manage them. So that's our first point. Knowledge of insect families is important. It's conservative. All right. So we're going to start out, this is our little guideline to my talk. We're going to start out about resources in my lab. And I heard that you already had a pollinator talk. So I'm just going to talk to you about how to conserve pollinators. I'm not going to give you a lot of information. So this is a garden that probably a lot of you envy. You look at it and it's nice and neat and organized, and there's spaces between everything. And this is a garden for people. This is a garden for insects, where everything is riotous, it's growing, it's touching. You have these vines all over, these heirloom vines that produce pollen and nectar, like this is Grandpa Ott, Morning Glory. Here's some kind of clematis and all native vegetation, which with some annuals in there and some cultivars, but plants that produce pollen and nectar. If you've seen these in Menards, these are called bee houses, and they're for the native bees, and they're stem nesting bees. And so you have to replace this every year, because you then get a buildup of insects that will kill the stem nesting bees. But we put this up at a state park, 4 state parks, and at the end of one summer, every one of these stems has somebody living in it. So at the end of the year in June, you just pull these out, you put new ones in. So one of the things to do for IPM in your backyard is you want to make sure that you have a diversity of plants in your landscape, native and heirloom plants. You want to use less pesticides. Water is good. A lot of bugs go drink water, believe it or not. So this just gives you an idea of a lot of the different things. Bird houses work, stem nesting bee houses work. Bumblebee houses do not work, and butterfly houses do not work. Don't spend your money. I always try to get people to understand about not just the 4 Bs, birds, butterflies, beneficials, and bees. That's the 4 Bs I talk about. And I want you to understand we're going to lose this little hummingbird very soon. They follow sapsuckers up north. That's their evolution. They come north with sapsuckers. Sapsuckers are almost endangered. They're on the threatened species. So what sapsuckers do in your rosaceous plants is they make holes. And then in the spring, when the nutrients come up from the roots, those holes fill with liquid and the sapsucker returns. And It's like a grocery store. It stops along the way where it made all these holes, and the hummingbirds feed with them. So if you've often wondered, how did hummingbirds get here in May when there's not much food, they're relying on sapsucker holes. And now that the sapsuckers are threatened, almost endangered, that's going to be a big issue. So put out hummingbird feeders. It's just 4 to 1, 4 parts water, 1 part sugar. I like to do 2 to 2. You have to change it every 2 days as it gets moldy. They like these hummingbird feeders with a little platform, or this kind with a platform. Plant Campsis radicans, that's a native. Don't buy it from Monrovia. It just grows vegetatively. I must have spent $2,000 to answer that question. Hitsis Dropmore scarlet honeysuckle. These are the 2 plants in our environment. They're heirloom. This is a native, this is an heirloom that will provide resources along with nectar feeders for hummingbirds. All right, so one of the things we're going to learn today, this is a native bee called a megachilid. And you see it here, it makes these C-shaped leaves. And here are some spots from some leaf disease, but none of this really matters. You can have spots on your roses from scab, you can have holes. There are more photosynthetic panels, leaves, on a rose bush than they need. And this is never going to kill a rose or even damage it. And what these leaf cutting bees do, and you'll notice these little white stripes, these are hairs coming out of the abdominal segments. They cut this hole and then they stick it in those stems that we saw back there. So they go into this stem and they put the leaf in, they put some pollen, and they lay an egg. And it's like a railroad car. They do 5 or 6 rows of that. So if you use pesticides on this rose, any insecticide, whether it's systemic or contact, you're going to kill these leaf feeding native bees. They're only out for about a month a year. So you really shouldn't have to worry about them. So one of the things we want to do in developing IPM programs for invasives is we need to understand what are the beneficials, the 4 Bs, the birds, the butterflies, the beneficials, and the bees that are in your backyard. And so I have a website I'm going to show you. So here is an example. Here's some stems. They look like logs, but they're really enlarged. Here's a stem nesting bee going inside. These live in the ground. These live in the ground. This is a megachilid we just saw. See those little white hairs coming out of the abdomen? This is something you have to manage for because they'll sting you. These are the guard wasps. Social wasps have division of labor like bumblebees and honeybees. Their job is to just sit at the entrance and sting you, bite you. They can do both. And here you have to know the difference that this, even though it's yellow and black, this is a native ground bee, not a wasp. So I have this website I developed. There's 3 of them. One's on IPM, one's on Pollinator Conservation, and the other one is an online course on pesticides. And this is the Pollinator Conservation. It's all done so that you can develop an IPM program that conserves pollinators. Anything that's on here is for the output of you understanding in your backyard. If you're going to do a cultural tactic or apply a pesticide, you have to do something that's going to conserve pollinators. And so I don't know if you guys know who Heather Holmes is. She's written the 5 books in the Midwest on bee identification. She made sure we got all this right. We have all the 25 families of bees and the next 10 families of wasps to help you understand the life history. Now, bumblebees are just one species, a social bee. 99 others. There's about 360 native bees in Minnesota. All the rest are ground nesting or stem nesting. So it's a lot of information for you to learn. So if you have rusty patch bumblebee, and in red here, I have this bumblebee watch. You take a picture with your phone, you send them a picture, and they'll tell you what species. The worker rusty patch, which is our endangered species, it's on the endangered species list, has this little rusty patch line. The males and the queens don't. So if you have a rusty patch bumblebee, and this map shows you its distribution, used to be one of the most common bees 20 years ago. It's almost gone now. Very few populations are they found in good numbers. We do find them in Minnesota, find them at the St. Paul campus. They're in Edina. And so if you do find it, you have to be very sure you don't apply pesticide. And you're not supposed to apply any pesticides to a habitat that endangered species lives in. We have posters you can download for free. I received an award. I wrote the 1998 Butterfly Gardening Bulletin. It's sold on Amazon for $150. Really, it is. This is the update during the pandemic. I decided I was going to do this. And these are all information about butterflies, all those behaviors that they do. And I used to work at the Smithsonian on the butterfly deck, and we had pictures on the walls of butterflies eating feces, butterflies drinking blood, and they do all those things. They're behaviors that they need for their life cycle. They puddle on water to pick up salts. The males give the salts to females. And so there's a lot of behaviors going on in your garden, and this book will help you identify. It also has a checklist of all the Minnesota butterflies. It has a section on IPM and how to develop programs so you don't kill butterflies. And here's Minnesota threatened and endangered species, the rusty patch with that little rusty patch on the workers. The coroner blue butterfly needs lupins, sandy soils around the Great Lakes. Federally endangered power chic skipperling, Dakota skipper, yellow-banded bumblebee is under review for federal listing. The monarch, they didn't federally list it as endangered in December, but it might get there one day. And here's the site that has all kinds of technical information about IPM. What I want to point out to you is this book. And each one of these links, you click on them and it gives you a page on the life history of a garden, tree pest, and how to manage it. So that's that really quick going through that. I only see you once in a while, but there's lots of stuff on the web I've made for you to look at. So the next thing I want to talk to you is when you do a management tactic, how do you conserve pollinators? So use contact insecticides on flowering plants, soaps, oils, bifenthrin, Bacillus thuringiensis. Don't use systemics. Plant a seasonal phenology of native and garden plants. Only single flowered. When they make a double flowered little marigold, they take the male part and that makes the double leaves. Provide overwintering habitats for bees. If they're in the ground or under the siding of your house, they're never going to sting you. Leave them alone. Do not kill queens. If you kill a queen or one of those little megacollids that was eating the leaf of the rose, it's all over. That individual dead, the population lost one. Understand the types of bees and wasps and how to tell the difference. All right, so here's a short version of the paradigm. Change the paradigm, reduce pesticide use contacts, don't use systemic neonics, reduce herbicide use, don't use fungicides unless you have proper diagnosis, and promote bee plants. All right, glyphosate affects bees. There are other parts of the view that might come talk to you and say glyphosate is safe for humans. I'm not interested in that. I'm interested in is glyphosate safe for bees, and it is not. These are just 3 papers I have up with the references to show you what I'm telling you is real. I always want you as a scientist, we have a way that we collect information to convince people or to create a new paradigm. So I just wanted to show you that these are published papers. Glyphosate affects bee gut. All that microflora you hear about with humans that we need, bees affect, glyphosate affects that. It alters bee navigation. And the third one, it alters larval development. So I want you to really rethink the use of pesticides, especially herbicides. We didn't use herbicides in the garden when I was a kid. This is something that's spilled over from agriculture. You know, in the spring, you'll see these truly green ChemLawn ads or Scott's, and kids are jumping up euphorically in slow motion on this grass, and there's not a weed in sight, and it's not necessary to have a lawn that's weed-free. Why? I mean, just ask yourself why. It costs money to apply herbicides. I just showed you they kill native bees and honeybees. You can spot treatment. They have these wicks where the herbicide goes on a wick and you just spot treat the noxious plants. The more fertilizer and nutrients compost you add back to your grass, the stronger it's going to grow, the thicker, and you have less weeds. So herbicides is really a recent industry promoted idea. It is not necessary. So I just want to explain about systemic. Systemic neonics are not like DDT. DDT persists in the environment because it was bioaccumulated, it was stored in fat, and it was biomagnified as one end of the trophic food chain, as a trout ate a daphne or a trout was eaten by a bald eagle. The DDT and its metabolite DDE went up in the food chain. The neonics don't do that, but they're highly water soluble and they sit in the environment. So here's a paper from Science Magazine. You apply a neonic to the soil, 80 to 98% stays there. Only 2 to 20% goes up in the plants and it gets into nectar and pollen. In 1996, the French beekeepers rioted in Paris, talking about this new neonic that was put in sunflowers, and they called it mad bee disease. 20 years of research later, we realized they were right, that it affects the movement of bees, their navigation, it even affects their feeding. So the neonics are something that we can use when you don't have the 4 Bs, birds, beneficials, bees, butterflies, but they have really extreme environmental effects. So compared to contact insecticides, the contacts, you spray them, they only last for a week or so, and then they biodegrade. The systemics, once it's put in the ground, gets picked up a plant, it can last 2 years. So there is something on my website to help you identify what is bee friendly, what pesticides. This is how we determine that. This is called an LC50 dosage dependent curve. And you take on the bottom on the x-axis different doses. These are the numbers of individuals that die. You figure out the median point, and that is how much of that pesticide will kill an insect. And from that, you create these charts. And this is a bulletin I have all over the website. It's easy to find, understanding pesticide toxicity. And in gray are those pesticides that are friendly to bees. In white, and I know this is impossible to see, so I'm just going to read you. The LD50, the microgram on a bee of one of the neonics is 0.004. If you compare that to an insect growth regulator, it's 25. So that is 1,000 times more toxic, the neonics, than other insecticides that are out there. All right, so there's 3 main groups of insecticides when you go to the store. I really suggest you don't use insecticides, just prune out the insects if you see them. But there's biorationals, which are registered by the EPA, and they're compatible with preserving our 4 Bs. Organic means it's OMR approved, the Organic Material Research Institute. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're not toxic. And conventional is something that's toxic. And so what are biorationals compared to conventionals? They don't last as long, they degrade quickly, they work on smaller insects, they're less harmful to the 4 Bs, low mammalian toxicity, and they may take a little longer to kill a pest, a day or 2 longer, but they do work. Here's some biorational insecticides, the BTs. So, BT is a protein that gets in the gut and it puts a hole in the gut. So there's BTs for moth. These are the different trade names. There's BTs for beetles. And this BT Galleria grub gone kills Japanese beetle grubs and adults. And it's a very new chemical microbial insecticide registered by the EPA that's helping us with Japanese beetle. If you have a fountain or a pond, you might use BT israeliensis that kills mosquitoes. What is an OMRI? So how is it different than a biorational? It has to be OMRI approved. So it has to be approved by the Organic Materials Research Institute, and it has to be a natural plant product. So the BTs, they're biorationals. This is a certain kind of fungus that prevents, you spray it on apples. Diatomaceous earth, garlic, kaolin clay, limonene is a plant phytochemical constituents of a conifer that's made into a insecticide. Neem oil, azadirachtin, horticulture oil. Pyrethrin is the natural daisy. Pyrethroid is the conventional that's made synthetically. So pyrethrins are just as toxic as any conventional insecticide. Just realize that. They're not non-toxic. So when it's organic, it means it's a natural product. It doesn't talk about its toxicity. If it's a biorational, it means it's not very toxic. So we're going to go on to IPM now. So, you know, the Minnesota Master Gardeners and the University Extension has been promoting bee lawns and rain gardens. This idea to bring back diversity to the landscape. If you go to my website, I have an article from the Scientific American from like 1980 where they talk about bee lawns. They're widely used in Europe for a long time. Europe doesn't have this fascination with herbicides we do. They let flowering plants grow in their bee lawns. Matter of fact, the St. Andrews in Scotland, where golfing started, their grounds are bee lawns. Their fairways are bee lawns. So realize that we have accepted a paradigm from the chemical industry that we don't have to accept. So you diversify your landscape with rain garden, native and heirloom plants for hummingbirds and clover. If you use any herbicide, it's going to kill the clover in your lawn. So when I was a kid, all lawns had clover in them. Once they started using herbicides, it killed all the clovers. So bees can feed on these clovers. They help. It's not a preferred plant, but it helps if they can't find other things to feed on. So IPM is a method based on educational information. It's a decision-making process with reduced risk to you in terms of it reduces pesticide exposure and risk. It's very information and education intensive. It's biologically based. It's cost effective. It's site specific. So I started out talking about leaf feeding beetles and Japanese beetles. With leaf feeding beetles, I would use that chemical called spinosad. It is a natural fungal product from the soil. It's formulated into an insecticide. And all the big nurseries here on caterpillars, they don't use conventionals anymore. They use spinosad. For Japanese beetle, I would use that grub gone. So use the multiple tactics, cultural, physical, genetic, biological, chemical, least toxic pesticide first, and make your aim to conserve the 4 Bs. So use soil tests for fertilizer. Don't over-fertilizing. You just make insect food. Manage pests with the principles of IPM. Plant flowers and shrubs for pollen and nectar for beneficials that kill pest insects. So in Minnesota, they released 4 biocontrol agents that attack emerald ash borer. They need to feed on pollen and nectar. So if you spray pesticides in your backyard, you're defeating the whole purpose of many biocontrol programs. So spot treat, not broadcast. Spray at less than, no, don't spray when the wind is above 8 miles per hour. Spray less often, tolerate more weeds, use contact insecticides. Save money on herbicide use and instead restore your grass's vigor. Add compost, top dress with compost. In the spring, it's a little messy, but in the fall, when the snow covers it, the compost you spread on the top, it disappears into the lawn. Add nutrients back, add organic fertilizers, add calcium back if your lawn needs calcium, do a soil test. So there's a lot you can do for your lawn that makes it grow more vigorously. It will exclude weeds. And it's just this weeds is like a chemically high way to control what we used to consider nuisance weeds in the lawn. Now, there still are some that are nuisance weeds, but like I said, clover is not a nuisance weed. So here's a little summary about biorationals. For Japanese grubs in the soil, you can use this chemical called acelepryn, chlorothan, and nitrophol. It comes in Grubex. So when you buy Grubex for your lawn, so if you buy Menard's product from your lawn, it has a really conventional insecticide. Scott's is using Grubex. So sorry, Scott's is using acelepryn. So you want to look for that. It's very friendly to bees. Spinosad, we just talked about for caterpillars and sawflies or beetle larvae. Neem oil, soaps, oils for anything soft-bodied like aphids or scales. And you do need imidacloprid or dimethifuran, those are neonics, when you have borers. When something is like this emerald ash borer and it's inside the bark, there's the larvae. They've taken a cross section so you see it, but that's hidden in the bark. You can't reach it with any other insecticide, but something that's systemic. So now they use enamectin benzoate more than they use the neonics. Enamectin benzoate is not very water soluble, so it doesn't have those same leaching. You don't throw it on the soil. You have to inject it in the plant and it stays in the plant. Okay, so we've talked about IPMs. I've given you this course in entomology French. We are the same language now. You know where to get resources because IPM is education information based. You know how to conserve pollinators. We talked about different ways, reducing herbicide use, spot treatments, changing your idea of what damage is. We talked about IPM, the principles of IPM, which is not just spraying insecticides, but making your lawn or your backyard more sustainable. And now we're going to talk about invasive insects. So I'm just going to do a case study, putting all of this together for Japanese beetle. So the grubs here, as they go from different sizes, they shed their skin. We call them instars. You see they have really big legs and really big mouth parts. They basically lay on their back and they prune off all the roots. So if you have an irrigated turf, the female, this is the adults, they respond to the irrigated turf. They like the color green that it is. And they have these mating balls where they mate, and then the female goes out and lays eggs in the soil. It came to the United States in 1916 from Japan. I once had the University of Kyoto radio station call me, and they wanted to know why Japanese beetles weren't a problem in Japan, but they were in America. And it's actually not just funny. That's a good question, because in Japan, they have these natural enemies, these things that kill them, and we're going to talk about them. So one of the first things is proper identification. This is a billbug, which lives in lawns. It's a weevil. You might think it's a Japanese beetle if you dig it up. It has no legs. So that should be your first sign. If you see an adult like this, it doesn't look anything like a Japanese beetle, right? It doesn't have these white tufts of hair. Black vine weevil, again, it lives in soil, no legs. This comes in nursery pots from Connecticut and the East Coast. They can't survive here previously, maybe now with global warming they can. And here's Japanese beetle. So identify your pest before you control it, because the life histories, when they're vulnerable to control, is completely different, and you use different chemicals. So here's Japanese beetle feeding on a flower, feeding on some blueberries. They feed on over 300 things. Here's a picture from a colleague in Kentucky. July 8th, 2 weeks later, the linden trees has no leaves due to Japanese beetle. There's these wonderful traps out there, but all they do is call them into your backyard. It's not a good idea. So here's this acetylprin that's in Scott Grubex. This is the biorational. I'm telling you not to use these neonics. There's imidacloprid, clothianidin, thiamethoxam, dimethifuran, all registered for lawns. Don't use them. Use the Scott Grubex. It works very well, and it's bee friendly. Or use this Grubbegon, this bacteria thuringiensis galleria. Remember, it lyses the gut of the insect. It's completely non-toxic to the dog or you or anybody that sits on the lawn. In there, I talked to you in a minute ago about emerald ash borer, which is biocontrol, these parasitoids that were released. Well, Japanese beetle, the USDA studied what biocontrol agents in Europe controlled them. And then the Minnesota Department of Agriculture, about 1998 to about 2005, released these. And they released a wasp called Typhia vernalis, which is a native in my state of Maryland. You see it at twilight going over the lawn, looking for Japanese beetle grubs to lay eggs on. And they also released a fly that looks just like a housefly called Isachetta. They were released, but they didn't amount to anything. So this is what the fly looks like. Sorry, this is what the wasp looks like. Typhia vernalis. She finds the Japanese beetle grub, and the different species lay eggs in different places. It didn't get established here.
Oh, yes.
So in the Northeast US, adult springs Typhia wasps feed on honeydew, but we just don't have the right climate or the right plants in the spring. They also released this wasp that looks like a housefly. It's called Isochetta aldrichii. It's a tachinid fly. It lays its eggs on top of the adult, and they bore into the adult. And this one didn't really get established. So I've been working on a research program the last 2 years of a soil inhabiting pathogen called Ovovesicula populi. Now, the Japanese beetle's name is Populus japonica. So this is when we see the species name in a scientific name, we know this is a specialist. So this fungus only attacks Japanese beetle. It was first discovered in Connecticut and New York, and it reduces grub populations in Michigan, where they've been studying it for 20 years. It reduces winter survival by 20 to 50%. And by 15 years, they had a 75% reduction. So people have always wondered in the East why Japanese beetle disappeared. And it probably disappeared from a combination of these natural biocontrols in the environment. So we're studying this in Minnesota. We're releasing it to get it established. All right, so we've learned about IPM. I gave you a case study. So to review Japanese beetle, we only target the grubs or the adults. We use biorational chemicals when we can. We realize that irrigated turf can have a lot of damage. So you may not even need to manage it if you don't see damage. And it comes out July 1st, it lasts through September. And it is one of the worst pests in Minnesota. So to be a pest, do you have to be invasive? No. So this is just to talk about that. This is another leaf feeding beetle. This is elm leaf beetle. See those? It doesn't have the lamulate, the little fan at the end. It has equal spaced antennae. It has the same life cycles as those other leaf feeding beetles in the picture. This one was introduced. It says native, but I don't know why I said that. It was introduced from Italy. It used to love American elms. It doesn't like these Siberian, these Zelkova elms. Asian ladyboard beetle eats the eggs and controls it. It's no longer a pest because of biocontrol. When I arrived in Minnesota, this was the third most common pest. It was, the first one was sawflies on aspen trees. Sawflies on birch trees, birch leaf miner sawfly. The second major one was clear-wing borers. And then you had this one on all the elms. But now that we don't have those elms, this pest is gone. This is a little beetle called Calligrapha that feeds on nine bark. It's a specialist. Frank's nursery years ago brought them to Minnesota. They got established in the landscape with infected stock. They're not here anymore, and it ended up that most of those yellow or purple varieties of nine bark aren't hardy anyway, so they're gone too. Sorry. And down here we have another introduced insect, an exotic. And exotics, when they get introduced, it's just like the Japanese beetle story when the people called me from the radio station in Kyoto, Japan. If it's native, it has natural enemies, and it's easier for it to be managed by its natural enemies than these invasive insects. All right, so the top 10 insect pests, it's whether they vector a virus or some kind of bacteria. So remember, Dutch elm disease was vectored by a beetle that carried a fungus. Those are the worst. They're very hard to manage. Insect evolution is conserved again. So if you know the family, you know what the damage can be. And in landscapes, it's very site specific. Different pests have different trees that they attack, and their management is very specific towards the vulnerable stage. So here, just to give you an example, this is the family Buprestidae. In Minnesota, this is two-lined, you see those two lines, oak borer. This, or sometimes chestnut oak borer. This one follows oak wilt. It's a native. It is not a borer that's causing problems on its own, but it's attracted to the smell of the oak wilt. The oak wilt is killing the tree anyway, so it attacks it. The beetle is not the causal agent, it's the oak wilt. Here's emerald ash borer in the same family. That's an exotic. That's a pest that we cannot manage without insecticides. Here's another native. This is apple tree borer. These are all in the family Buprestidae. They're dorsoventrally flattened, so they're like a U-shaped. And when they come out of the wood, they make a U-shape rather than a round shape. And down here is bronze birch borer. It's native. It would attack our yellow birches, and it was managed by the chemicals in the bark. But when people planted those white European birches, it killed them, and we're not planting those anymore. So because of Dutch elm disease and the virus in the exotic beetle, we no longer have American elms. We no longer have chestnut trees because of chestnut blight. We no longer have white-colored birch trees unless it's a native birch that has those really thick bark that exfoliates, that it's really hard for the insect to bore into. So it's not whether it's a native or an exotic. Natives can be pests too. It all has to do is how they're managed. Do they have biocontrol in the environment, native insects to kill the pest? And if it comes from overseas, it absolutely doesn't have anything that's going to kill it. So here is the Cerambycid family. It's just another family. They're called longhorn beetles. They're much bigger than the Buprestids. They are not dorsoventrally flattened. So when they emerge, they make a round hole. And here is a Asian longhorn beetle. That is an exotic. A dogwood twig borer, that's a native. An elm borer, and a milkweed beetle. So this one, milkweed beetle, they feed on milkweeds in August. Doesn't kill them. They cut the vein and then they eat the whole leaf. This insect here, the Asian longhorn beetle, is a pest on maples, box elders, horse chestnuts. It's a huge extent. It's a huge outreach issue. They manage to quarantine it, but it keeps popping up, and they have to cut down the trees. That's the only way to get rid of it. This is a beetle that gets inside the twigs of dogwood, and the twigs fall off. Nobody ever manages for it. Elm borer gets inside the bark, and it will eventually kill the tree. But it's really hard to manage for it. Insecticides, even systemic insecticides, don't work really well. And nobody really manages this for their milkweed, because by the time they come out, the milkweed has pretty much stopped flowering, and it's just making seed, put its energy in seed, because it comes out late in the year. All right, so here's the family Scarabaeidae. Again, you can have members like Japanese beetle that are an exotic, but this one is masked chafer. It comes from North America. See those little masks there? Chafer in German means beetle. This is Oriental beetle. This is a pest, but not in Minnesota. It hasn't gotten here. And here we have rose chafer, which is found in Minnesota. We don't even know the host plant for the larvae. We think it's birch roots, but it's not a pest. So masked chafers are native, but they're not a pest either. So the only two native ones here, these two are not pests, but these two exotic ones are pests. So do we ever send, so you're listening, talking about Japanese beetle, talking about Asian longhorn beetle, we just spoke about in the Scarabaeidae family, Japanese beetle, European chafer. So we're getting all these pests from Europe. Is there reciprocity? Do we send stuff overseas? Absolutely. Japanese beetle 2015 found in airports in Italy. They came on planes from airports that had high Japanese beetle infestations. In 220, Respighi wrote that classical music called The Pines of Rome. Well, they're being decimated. See, here's the guy on a ladder spraying on a cherry picker for pine tortoise scale that came from the US, probably on Christmas trees. Monarch butterflies in 1840, as early as 1840, people start taking them, releasing around the world. As long as there's plants in the family Apocynaceae, which milkweeds are in, they can feed on other host plants. So yes, we export them and we import them. And as soon as you get travel by planes, you're just increasing the number of invasives coming in. So the summary so far has been native insects tend to not be pests because they're managed by biocontrol. Exotic insects that come free of pathogens, free of parasitoids, predators, they reach high numbers. So this is just a lovely picture of this really nice iridescent blue-breasted emerald ash borer. It arrived in 1992. There's a federal quarantine on it. Here's its galleries on the wood. And the only way to maintain it is with pesticides injected in the bark. That's the only way for you to save a tree. They're killing all the trees. Here is gypsy moth. This is another exotic. It's another quarantine. So emerald ash borer is state and federal quarantine, so is gypsy moth. This is the male, this is the female, she's white. She lays her eggs in an egg mass, then pulls the hairs off her abdomen and puts them on the wet mass. It keeps them insulated. It also keeps other insects from eating them. They first all hatch out. The guys that hatch out last, the first hatched out first eat them. Many butterflies do that. They put more eggs so that the larvae that hatch out first gain energy by eating the eggs that are earlier. This is what it looks like, and it looks a lot like our nymphalid butterfly that painted, the nymphalid butterfly that overwinters in Minnesota. It looks a lot like it, the morning cloak, except it has these 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 pairs of red spots, which the morning cloak does not have. This is when a gypsy moth dies from virus. It bends in half. It can die from a fungus, and then it stays upright on the trunk of the tree. And that fungus is what now manages gypsy moth in the east, where there's enough rainfall for it to survive. So the gypsy moth came from Asia, and this fungus came from Asia. We didn't introduce it on purpose. Researchers went to forests in Europe to look at gypsy moth, and they bought the spores back on their boots. When I was at the New York Botanical Garden in 1990, it was first discovered, and it was really doing a job managing gypsy moths. Here is a little, it's called an adelgid. It's basically a aphid that lives on a spruce tree. And here's what they look like. And there are these little flat things, and then, like aphids or any other sucking insects, they make this coating on them. And they're a real pest in the Appalachian Mountains because the roots of hemlocks hold the streams together for trout fishing. So if you've ever heard that the presidents are going to Camp David is a hemlock forest, and there's trout streams up there. And so as soon as the hemlocks start losing photosynthate, the needles start dropping off, they start dying, then the roots don't work very well, and the stream gets broader and not deep enough for the trout. So and plus around practically every national monument in the East, whether it's Williamsburg or the Capitol, they plant hemlocks as trees, or they prune them as hedges. And so hemlock woolly adelgid is really a big issue in those older plantation homes where they've been around 200, 300, or 100 years, these hedges. So the only way to manage this is with imidacloprid. So it doesn't make any flowers, so there's no problem with the 4 bees of interacting with it. Here's the European elm bark beetle we talked about. It brought a fungus with it that killed elm trees. So the management was always against the fungus, not against the beetle. We did have a native elm bark beetle that was there, killed a few trees, but not to the extent of the European one because it brought this fungus with it. Again, the only way to manage it was with a fungicide, but when I first moved here in 1994, my road was lined with 50 beautiful elms with their branches. It was like driving down an accolade for a wedding. It was the most beautiful thing you've ever been in. And now there's like 2 elms left. It's just a sin what this disease and beetle did. All right, and how many of you ever seen this? This is Erwinia. It gets on your squash plants and makes your squash plants get wilt. They flop over. It does the same thing to rosaceous plants like roses or other tree, plums, pears. And it gets into a bee carries it, a honeybee carries it, the spores. It gets into the shoot and then it turns the wood yellow and it kills the whole tree. So this is another invasive that is a problem. Okay, birch leaf miner sawfly from Europe. The sawfly lives inside the leaf. Again, I said this is no longer a problem, mostly because we got rid of the European white birches, but also because there is a native birch leaf miner that's almost identical, and the predators and parasitoids caught up with this European one. Here is this Asian longhorn beetle. Look at how in the family Cerambycidae, they're called the longhorn beetles. This looks really weird, but that's the pupae, doesn't it?
Oh, wow.
It looks like a goat human kind of thing. This is, it chews the bark and then turns around, lays an egg. So it helps the egg penetrate the bark. And this is a great picture of one emerging, pupated in the bark and is emerging in the adult. This one, because it's so big and charismatic, they've managed to keep it within certain habitats in the east. So it shows up now and then, but they always manage to control it. Clearwing borers, like I said, besides years ago, it was that birch leaf miner sawfly. Clearwing borers, they mimic wasps, but again, look at their antennae. Wasps have elbowed antennae. This is a filiform antennae, it's a moth. And these things get into the bark of trees, and here's a big, and it looks like weed whipper damage. There's a big larvae in there. They get into the rosaceous plants of the arboretum. They can't grow viburnums. They have trouble with roses. And so when I was a kid, it was my job to take a hanger and put it up all these holes to kill, probe it, squish these larvae in their galleries. But now you can just spray this with nematodes. I did it at my mother's house. I ordered online some nematodes. I opened the bark.
Did you have fun?
Made the nematodes in there. It killed all the borers. And then the viburnum just puts up a new shoot.
I was asking him if he had fun.
Cut out this old shoot. So this is what the clearwing borer does. It makes this.
I said
It's first it's white and then it turns gummy. And this
no,
is.
I'm watching a webinar. I was
weed
just
whipper
asking
damage.
Satchmo if he had fun.
Clearwing borer damage. Somebody's microphone is on. We're hearing you.
There's a lot of microphones still on.
Okay, and this is what they look like, the larvae, and this is what the adults. They sit on the side of trees and they mimic wasps, but just look at these antennae. Wasps have elbowed antennae. These have these long filiform antennae. So these parasitic nematodes are the best way to control it. I just want to go over a few other exotic pests very quickly. This is the Drosophila suzuki that came in the came around 2020, 2015. It appeared in the US in 2008. This is the states that have it. So this darker color is what are really problematic. Minnesota has it. This is what it does to some strawberries. They just get in there and they eat the strawberries. And they're working on IPM programs with different kind of mulches because the fly falls to the ground. You can't spray for it because you eat the food. So they use these traps, just as beer or something. They're attracted to alcohol, but to manage it, they're trying to put mulches underneath the raspberry plants or blueberry plants to control it. This is another one that is beautiful. It's called the spotted lanternfly. It's from China and India, Vietnam. It started to show up in 2012. It's a real problem. In pink here, this is the states it's most common. In orange. We don't have the host. There's a host tree called Ailanthus altissima that so far it's been too cold for it to grow here. And that's its preferred host to lay eggs on. But in the east, since Ailanthus altissima, people don't use them in the landscape. They grow by railroad tracks. They're feeding on many plants. And this is the density on the side. So here's a close-up. And here's the density of how many lanternfly. And this will kill the trees. They put their mouth part in, they distort the bark, and the xylem and phloem doesn't move. And here is brown marmorated stink bug. I've already found 3 coming out of the walls in my kitchen. They've appeared on the windowsill. I squashed them. There is a native stink bug that's a good stink bug. It's a predator, but it has spines. It's called the 2-spine stink bug. So if you see a stink bug without any spines, and then it tells you here, no spines, and has this distinctive pattern like a Japanese beetle, dark and light. It gets into fruits, tomatoes. Again, the red is where it's the most common, but it's arrived in Minnesota. And that's another exotic pest we don't have good management for. Crane flies grow in lawns. They're pretty big. They're about the size of your pinky. They're very large. There's a native species, and then there's a European crane fly in a marsh, family Tepulidae. These things grow, they make burrows in the lawn and they kill the grass. And they are a problem. They're a problem in the Pacific Northwest. Sometimes they show up in the western part of Minnesota. But again, it's a fly. It's very difficult to manage because they live in the ground most of the time. And so here's the life cycle, like Japanese beetle. Eggs are laid in August and September. They grow underground for the winter. They come out and they pupate. They turn into what looks like a large mosquito. If you ever have a mega mosquito on your ceiling, that's a Tepulidae. And what is the management? Again, nematodes or that chlorothalonitropol that is cellophrin, because they're hidden in the turf. Just like a borer is hidden in the trunk of the tree, it's hard to manage something that's in the turf. I think you've heard about this in the news, but this Vaspora sorora, the Asian hornut, it's really big. And what it's doing here is these are the pupae of honeybees. It takes the cap off and it eats the pupae. And it is huge. It's about the size of your palm. They have these huge mouth parts. So it's about this big. So you'll know if you have it, but here are just different stripe patterns. This is the queen. She has different stripes than the workers. But look at these big mouth parts. When I say anything that's in the Hymenoptera, whether it's a beneficial parasitoid or a wasp like a yellow jacket, it has these ovoid antennae. See back there? There's an elbow in the antennae. And the last one I want to talk to you about is jumping worms. They were imported as fishing worms. They jump around. Didn't think they'd get established here because they're from warm Asia, but they do. And what they do, there's so much damage in the Undisturia forest that all the seedlings die. And I'm working on a grant to manage this. So the bottom line is exotic invasive insects are usually more of a problem because they come without their natural enemies. Sometimes they're difficult to manage that if they're in the bark or in the fruit. We have to come up with different ways to manage them than ones that are external, feeding outside. So the bottom line is invasives are always more difficult to manage because they come without the natural biocontrol that's been building up for hundreds of thousands of years that helps keep them in check. So do you guys have any questions for me? I think I ended on time. I didn't take up more than an hour, 55 minutes. So does anybody have any questions for me?
If you have a question, unmute your microphone and speak up.
Don't be shy. No question is bad.
Hi, this is Peggy Nerdahl, and I have a question about the lily beetle, because I know that there's been about 80 sightings in Minnesota.
Yeah, it comes in on lilies that people grow in their ponds. Do you have it in a pond lily? In a lotus?
I haven't, I have a lot of lilies, I have a couple thousand, but I don't have lily beetle myself. I'm just fearful that it's going to get established. And I know that there's a wasp.
Yeah, it's, usually when these pests come in, they do spread, and it's found on lilies. It's a specialist. It's a little red beetle, and it spreads all over. And it's not a quarantine pest, which is bad, because that means there's no oversight and people will ship it more. So hopefully maybe our winters are still too cold for it to get established. But yes, it is a serious problem because it builds up into high numbers on lilies. And it's a specialist. It only feeds on lilies.
How are you going to go after the jumping worm?
Yeah, so there is a chemical out there called, it's a compost tea. It's called tea seed meal. And so when the tea plants get old or when they prune them, they put all the leaves in a compost pile and then they bag it as a soil amendment. What has a chemical in it called a saponin. And those saponins kill jumping worms. So I'm putting in a grant. I have a chemist from South Dakota who's going to identify exactly what chemicals in the TC meal are killing the jumping worms. Then we'll work with the USDA to try to get it registered as an insecticide. So right now we don't have, I can't tell you to use this TC meal, seed meal for jumping worms because it's not registered as an insecticide. And so that would be against federal law if I asked you to use something that wasn't registered. So we're working on, I have a grant I'm working on today to try to get some data to get a label for whatever we find is the active ingredient in compost tea. So I think I'll stop the recording now. How about that?